Well, good morning. Can everybody hear me? Okay, well, it's great to be here again. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is John Fahey. I went to Star King School for Ministry with Nina about 20 years ago, and it's wonderful to be here. The holiday season always brings up a variety of memories for me, some good and some not so good. But I had one of my most transformative experiences in 1968 when I was just 9 years old. And my oldest brother Kevin came home from Cornell University for the Christmas holiday. There were two brothers between me and Kevin, and all four of us grew up in our Boston Irish Catholic neighborhood. And it was actually the suburbs of Boston, and my parents were on their way from the poor shanty Irish neighborhoods of my grandfathers into the wealthier lace-curtain Irish neighborhoods of the suburbs, to which all the Irish families of that Boston generation aspired to live in. The Fahey boys all went to CCD, or Catholic Catechism, religious education on Saturday mornings, and at least once a month it was confession on Saturday afternoons. Some of us were the altar boys on Sunday morning, and we all went to St. John's Prep High School. It was not an unusual childhood by any means in Massachusetts, as I think Matt could probably attest to, who also is from Massachusetts. And everyone I knew had the same routine, even the Italians. As a side note, in my neighborhood, when Stephanie Salvucci married Jimmy Fitzgerald, that what was known as a mixed marriage. But in 1968, when my oldest brother Kevin arrived home in December from college for the Christmas break, and he was the first in his generation to go off to college, he had changed. In the spring of 1968, when he went off to college, the students at St. John's Prep had crew cuts. They wore sport coats. They dressed in white shirts and dark ties. And they did not walk on the grass, because Brother Linus would walk up behind you and whack you in the back of the head with this giant table and this giant Bible yelling, "Get off the grass!" And in those days, in my family, if you complained to your parents about Brother Linus, you probably get whacked in the head again by your Irish mother, because the logic was that if you had done something to offend Brother Linus, you probably deserved a hit in the head. My father was a World War II veteran and my mother was a school teacher, so there was very little sympathy for breaking the rules, which may be part of the reason why I have never met a boundary I didn't want to push, and I feel so comfortable here in Unitarian Universalism. But when my brother Kevin walked through the door that December evening, he had really long hair, he had a long bushy beard, he was dressed in dungaree jeans and an old army coat, and he had a backpack and a guitar slung over his back. This guy was so cool. He was a hippie. Nina probably would have loved him. My father told him to get a haircut. My mother said he needed a bath, and my grandmother, bless her heart, said he looked wonderful. My two older brothers and I were in awe. We had heard of hippies, but now there was one standing right in our living room. But the following Sunday was when the real fireworks began. Kevin told my parents he was not going to go to church. He didn't believe anything about Catholicism, that he was done with all that doctrine and dogma, and he was, in fact, an atheist. Well, now there's an atheist hippie in the house. What followed was a very loud and boisterous argument in our small 3-bedroom home with 6 people living there, and we could all hear the ruckus. I had no really idea what an atheist was as a 9-year-old, but it must have been pretty bad because my parents were very upset. What really amazed me was the fact that my brother was standing up to my parents, especially my father, who was a rather large man and knew how to follow orders, and he knew how to give them. It took me a few more years to appreciate the real power in the family was centered not in my father, but in my mother, the school teacher. But we'll save that for a feminist theology discussion. God was not dead for me yet. But the power that my parents had over my brother was quickly diminishing, and their end of their control over him was in sight. Power in family systems, in Unitarian Universalism, in process philosophy, and in the United States and the world is really a fascinating topic. I'm reminded of a scene from the Soprano television series. You remember The Sopranos, the crime-based series. Many of you know it, and the story revolves around Tony Soprano and his family. Tony's a New Jersey-based mobster, portraying the difficulties that he faces as he tries to balance his family life with his role as the leader of a mafia criminal organization. In this particular scene that I remember, he and his wife Carmela are struggling with their 19-year-old teenage daughter and some of her antics. After the argument between the parents and the teenager, the husband Tony quietly turns and says to Carmela, "When she figures out we don't have any power, we are in big trouble." Now, Tony used a little different language, but I'm sure that you can all understand where I'm going with that one. But the power of God, or the power that God lacks, or maybe the power that God does not have, perhaps the power that God might have, couple any of those notions with the power that we as human beings have, well, now we're talking Unitarian Universalist theology. Like the Sopranos, our Unitarian Universalist history is strewn with power struggle over who has the power and how is that power best used. Who has the power, the UUA or the local congregation? The board or the minister? The congregation or the minister? From the very beginning, we as Unitarian Universalists were very clear about the power of God as it related to Jesus Christ. Jesus was a human being, a great guy, liked to party with a little wine every now and then, lost his temper on occasion, especially when merchants were conducting business in the temple, and usually he was a pretty good role model. But, and this is where we get into trouble with our Christian brothers and sisters outside of Unitarian Universalism, Jesus was not divine. Unless, of course, as Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists taught us, Jesus had a spark of the divine inside him, a spark of goodness and love present in the universe, available to each and every one of us, and that divine goodness is drawn forth and out of us by participating in religious community. Our Christian and Transcendentalist ancestors teach us that good theology can change lives, and that bad theology can lead to violence and planetary destruction. We see it in the news every day, in the acts of religious terrorists and white nationalists who believe that murder and intolerance is somehow blessed by God? Really? Come on. And the worship of political power who identify Jesus and God somehow with the rantings of polarizing politicians, including the President of the United States, well, that's just bad theology. Our Christian and Transcendentalist ancestors taught us that healthy theology gives birth to hospitality and care of the earth, including the animals. This way of thinking and being in the world is discussed and debated here in our fellowship, using inspiration from theologies like process thought and our human brains. Even though, as the great process philosopher and physicist Alfred North Whitehead suggested, we are at best inconsistently rational human beings. Inconsistently rational human beings. Our Unitarian Universalist history is marked by very specific events and moments in time. You can go way back to Egypt, to the early Christian theologians 2,000 years ago, where the Arian controversy erupted in the 4th century, debating whether God was one person or three, a Unitarian or a Trinitarian. We basically lost that one, unfortunately, during the Council of Nicaea, when the emperor, a political figure, rigged the election in favor of Trinitarianism. What can I say? It happens. In 1568, 1,200 years later, the Edict of Torda was delivered, proclaiming religious freedom for the first time by an Eastern European king in Transylvania, heavily influenced by the Unitarian minister and theologian Francis David. Some of you remember Francis David for his phrase, "We need not think alike to love alike." There is so much political and historical significance in that Edict of Torda that our Unitarian Universalist tradition in our country continues to rely upon. The commitment that faith is not endowed by governments, but by what we as a community covenant to agree what is sacred, what is holy, what's important to us as a community. That a free pulpit and a free pew are necessities for free religious communities. Even the beginnings of our commitment to resist authoritarianism as a religious practice is signaled in that Edict of Torda. In more modern times, the 1819 sermon, Unitarian Christianity, that we talked about last month, delivered at the ordination of a new minister, is a watershed moment for us, splitting us off from the Congregational Church of New England, in whose building we are now sitting. A few decades later, Ralph Waldo Emerson would again rock the establishment, proclaiming at the Harvard Divinity School graduation that we as human beings can have a direct relationship with the divine. We don't need a church, we don't need the Bible, or even a minister. We can have a direct relationship with the divine. Now think about delivering that message to the Harvard Divinity School graduating class. Ralph doesn't get invited back for a very long time to Harvard Divinity School. Emerson wrote, "God builds his temple in the hearts of human beings, on the ruins of churches and religion." Pretty powerful stuff from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And in 1920, another controversy erupts in the Unitarian denomination, again at Harvard Divinity School, this time around humanism. The Reverend John Dietrich, in another address to ministers in training, begins publishing pamphlets and sermons questioning the Judeo-Christian tradition, the theistic basis of the prevailing religion of the time, and the question of why do we even need God to be religious? The faculty gathered ministers, and some students were outraged. But some were not outraged. Some rather liked the ideas. And the controversy that emerged became known as the theist-humanist controversy. Reverend Dietrich wrote that the trend in modern religious developments is away from the transcendent, the authoritative, the dogmatic, and toward the human, the experimental, away from the extraordinary mystic expression, the exalted mood, the otherworldly, and toward the ethical, the social, and the worldly, away from religion conceived as one of man's concerns, and toward religion guided by science and conceived as man's one concern, religion guided by science. This humanist thinking was epitomized in the Humanist Manifesto, signed by several Unitarian ministers as well as by prominent scholars and philosophers. The manifesto stressed that theism is past and that the universe is self-existing and not created, that the traditional dualism of mind and body must be rejected, and that religion must formulate its hopes and plans in the light of the scientific spirit and method, all very complementary to process thought. In no other denomination, I believe, but Unitarianism, with its aversion to creeds and dogmas, could such a non-theistic movement as radical as religious humanism have arisen without provoking a complete schism. And even Unitarianism found it hard-pressed to encompass the new thought. Yet another controversy. And so I asked myself, is it possible to be a Christian religious humanist informed by transcendentalism? I think the answer is yes for me, although I might add the word naturalist to the identity of religious humanist, because The notion of religious humanists is way too anthropocentric, too focused on human beings, and the word naturalist is added to the identity. It shifts the focus to nature rather than to human beings. And I can always use a little help remembering that I am not the center of the universe, as my wife will often lovingly remind me. But nature by itself tends to be morally neutral. Nature's rain falls on Donald Trump as easily as Joe Biden. Disease and death afflict everyone, regardless of their character. There is a reason that anonymity is the spiritual principle of 12-step programs. The disease of addiction doesn't care if you're male or female, white or black, gay or straight. Nature, by itself, knows little of justice, kindness, generosity, or most importantly, love. Religious humanism adds value to nature, as practiced by our Unitarian ancestors, and still today. Religious humanism has as one of its core principles our first principle, one that we're all supposed to covenant and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So religious humanism provides the value system that nature lacks. Unitarian Universalists who have rallied around the identity of being a religious humanist naturalist reject the idea of a supernatural realm, but emphasize the importance of communities that affirm our statement of principles, and there are many. You don't need a supernatural God to intervene in your life or the promise of an afterlife in heaven as a reward in order to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person or have respect for the interdependent web of which we are all a part. Truth is available to us in many ways, including the scientific empirical method. And if your truth or religion fails the scientific empirical method, well, then you got some explaining to do. The past few months we have discussed Christianity, transcendentalism, religious humanism, naturalism, and many other philosophical and religious concepts. I'd like to close today with a metaphor called the cathedral of the world, imagined by the late Reverend Dr. Forrest Church. Imagine, if you will, a cathedral of the world. In this cathedral of the world, there are windows beyond number, some long forgotten, others revered by millions, the most sacred of shrines. Each, in its own way, is beautiful. Some are abstract, others representational, some dark and meditative, others bright and dazzling. Each window tells a story about the creation of the world, the meaning of history, the purpose of life, the nature of humankind, the mystery of death. The windows of the cathedral are where the light shines through. And I love the light that shines through some of these windows. As with all metaphors for meaning, this one is imperfect. The light of God or truth or being itself, if you are a religious humanist, shines not only upon us, but out from within us as well. Together with the windows, we're part of the cathedral, not apart from it. Together, we comprise an interdependent web of being. The cathedral itself is constructed out of star stuff, and so are we. We are that part, that known part of the creation that contemplates itself. Part of the poem that we ponder. Because the cathedral is so vast, our life so short, and our vision so dim, we are able to contemplate only a tiny part of the cathedral. Explore a few of the windows, reflect upon the play of light and darkness through a very few of its myriad windows. Yet, since the whole is contained in each of the parts, as we ponder and act on the insight from our ruminations, we may discover insights that will invest our days with meaning in our lives with purpose. We may discover insights that will invest our days with meaning in our lives with purpose. A 21st century theology based on the concept of one light and many windows offers to us both breadth and focus. Honoring many different religious approaches, we do exclude the truth claims of absolutists, those that would hurt others in the name of religion. That is because fundamentalists claim that the light shines through their windows only. Some go so far as to urge their followers to throw stones through other people's windows. Angry atheists can draw the opposite conclusion. Seeing the bewildering variety of windows and observing the craziness of the worshipers, they conclude that there is no light. But the windows are not the light. They are where the light shines through. We shall never see the light directly in this metaphor, only as refracted through the windows of the cathedral. Prompting humility, life's ultimate mystery lies hidden beyond current human knowledge. The light, God, truth, whatever you want to call it, is veiled. Love in a religious community, with our Unitarian minds and Universalist hearts, is cause for great wonder and joy. I humbly stand in the cathedral of the world, trembling with awe, and sometimes, not often enough, with great joy. Amen, and thank you again for having me.